Hi, it's Popeye from Milk Tea Time for Localizers. As we know, we've been dedicated to promoting voices for small countries in the world, as we realize that the cultures that belong to themselves have been easily mistaken or even been ignored, especially in the global localization map. So today, we're very happy to show you guys more insights into Asian markets. As someone from the small country in Asia, I really think people outside of this area are easily getting confused about what cultures can be considered representative to an area of Asia. So today we're very honored to have an experienced localization professional in Singapore, Ming. And we will listen to the most authentic voices from her about her insights and her opinions about the special markets in Southeast Asia. Welcome.
Thank you.
So before we start the interview today, I believe there are some audiences or people watching our video now are not that familiar with the Asian markets. So can you please talk about location or the background, even the history of Singapore in general, so that people can have better understanding about the topic that we're gonna delve into more today?
Sure. So Singapore is actually in Southeast Asia. It's located south of China, Thailand, and Malaysia. And we're situated on the southern tip of Malaysia along the Malacca Strait, which is actually one of the busiest shipping routes in the world. And this shipping route actually connects the Indian and Pacific Oceans, which is why Singapore has kind of evolved to become like a busy shipping hub in the world. Because of this strategic location, Singapore used to be a British colony in the 1800s and 1900s. But after World War II, we gained independence from Malaysia in 1965, and we have been a country ever since. So something interesting that many people don't know is that Singapore is both a city and a country at the same time.
Well, that's interesting. Well, personally, I have some friends from Singapore too, so I've been long curious about how you think the geographic location of Singapore has affected the cultural identity or even like personality of most of the Singaporeans in general.
So definitely because of the fact that we're situated along the shipping routes, so that means that it has helped the economic development of Singapore. But more than that, I think because we're situated in the heart of Asia, so that links us to kind of be the bridge between Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. And at the same time, Singapore is also a melting pot for many different cultures because a lot of people come to Singapore, whether it's in the past, like my grandparents' generation when they were immigrants here, or like today when people come to Singapore to work and to live. So that's kind of created like this multiracial, multicultural identity that we have today.
Yeah, I agree on this one. Yeah, I think multiculturalism is like an essential part of Singaporean cultures. Yeah, and it's kind of like it's also fundamental to the soft power in Singapore. Yeah, and by the way, also I think I can also understand how colonization, that things you mentioned earlier, how colonization in early history affected the cultural identity of an area. Like someone from Taiwan, I think because Taiwan has been colonized by Japan between 1895 and 45, I think, almost a century. So I think this has made a long and profound effects on the cultural identity in my country. So question for you, how do you think the British colonization in the early history in Singapore has affected the cultural identity in general in your country?
It's definitely made an impact on Singapore because a lot of the early laws and the early structure of how our country was set up was actually influence left over from the British. So a lot of British legislation, laws were left behind. And I think more than that is also the fact that we use English as a working language is also a remnant of the British colony era. But that's also something that has definitely pushed forward our development and growth as a country until today.
Cool. So after talking about the unique location of Singapore, I think we can just get started with the very first question today. Well, first question today is that when it comes to Singapore, I believe a great majority of audiences today would come up with like one specific question, like what is Singlish and what is English system in Singapore? And how is Singlish different from formal English, like American or British English? Do you want to clarify something about that?
Sure. So in Singapore, we do use English as a main working language because of our history as a British colony. We do use British English in schools as a language of formal instruction. So we use British spelling, British grammar, and that kind of thing. As for Singlish is an English Creole language, I guess you can call it that way, that evolved from our history as a British colony. So we use words and pronunciation from British English, but it took on the grammatical structure of other languages that are local to Singapore. So languages like Chinese and Malay. So besides pronunciation and word differences, I guess the biggest difference is that Singlish kind of imitates the grammatical structure of Chinese, for example. So if I were to give you an example specifically, when we're asking someone, have you had lunch in, let's say, standard English, right? In Singlish, you might say, you eat lunch already or not, which kind of corresponds to the grammatical structure in Chinese, 你吃午饭了没有? So that's why many people say that Singlish is a highly efficient language in a way, but that's also what makes it hard for foreigners to understand what we're saying. But one thing is that these days, most of the younger generation, they can usually code switch pretty well, so foreigners and people of other cultures and other countries can also understand when we're working with them, like in professional settings or in school, for example.
Yeah, I agree on that part. I think, like you said, Singlish is considered a highly efficient language, and I also found one more feature about Singlish is that, well, like you guys try to add some foreign language to Singlish to make it more diverse, and easily to be understood. For example, like I heard some friends of mine who are from Singapore as well, and they they easily add Chinese into their English, especially when they're communicating with in a professional setting, but with Chinese-speaking people, for example. So like let's say when we're grilling some pork, together, they may say like, hey, you want to try it to see if the meat is so or not. So it's kind of interesting, So after talking about the language system, Singlish system in Singapore, I think we can move on a little bit to talk more about the Chinese system. As we know, there's been a lot of Chinese-speaking population in Singapore, which is great and impressive. But even though I'm not really familiar about the origin of this, this language system, why it gains so prevalent in Singapore. Maybe we can talk about it later in the following video. First, I want to ask you, because I believe some audiences may be feeling as confused as I am about the Chinese system in Singapore. Now, as a localization professional, how do you think the differences are between the Chinese in mainland China, like the simplified Chinese in China, traditional Chinese in Hong Kong, and the traditional Chinese in Taiwan? And what about the Chinese system in Singapore? Can you please elaborate on that?
Sure. So the reason why there is a large Chinese race in Singapore is because in the early 1900s, there were many Chinese immigrants who immigrated to Singapore from the provinces of Guangzhou, Fujian, and Hainan as well. So that's why there is a large Chinese population in Singapore. So a lot of people from my grandparents' era, so like my grandfather, for example, he actually came down to Singapore from Fujian province in I think the early 1940s or something. So as for your question, I think to differentiate them, simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese are two types of writing systems for Chinese, where some characters in simplified Chinese differ from traditional because they were either the strokes were reduced or some characters have been merged for the same meaning. So I believe that these characters are largely the same for traditional Chinese, but in some certain specific instances, like in traditional Chinese in Hong Kong, for example, there are some words that are used specifically for Cantonese that don't exist in Mandarin. So in Singapore, we use simplified Chinese in schools. That's the language that we learn. And I think it's largely similar to standard simplified Chinese or the Chinese that's used in China, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, as a user of traditional Chinese in Taiwan, I think I can totally understand that. But like, I think, for example, like the Chinese system in Taiwan, I think one of the weaknesses not for us, for me in particular, like it takes me forever to read simplified Chinese. And I can pretty much say like in our country or in our markets, we've never seen simplified Chinese until like we go abroad or we work closely with Chinese people, at the job market. So I think for us, our market isn't that as diverse as you guys are in Singapore. Yeah, so my question is that, well, even for example, like before the question, even like the traditional Chinese in Hong Kong, as we know, there are some characters, Chinese characters are coined in traditional Chinese in Hong Kong to cater to the people or the user in Hong Kong. So those words can be easily understood by us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so how can you train yourself like to be familiar with different systems of Chinese used in different locales?
Personally for me, I can read traditional Chinese, but that's because I kind of familiarize myself with like popular culture. So, for example, watching Hong Kong dramas or Taiwanese variety shows, for example. So I think that's a kind of easy way and a fun way to learn traditional Chinese. If you're talking about learning it in school, we didn't have that opportunity, so we mainly just learned simplified Chinese, but that's a good way to kind of make yourself more interested in different writing systems of Chinese.
Got it. Well, now I would like to be more specific about the differences between Malaysia and Singapore. Well, as we know, both countries are like closely connected to each other, right? And you border very closely with Malaysia.
Mm-hmm.
So in this question, I also wonder how Singaporean Chinese is different from the Chinese in Malaysia. Is there any examples that you can elaborate for the Chinese differences?
I think there is not that big of a difference in terms of the words that we use, but maybe a bit more of the accent or the pronunciations. So that's how you might tell that someone is from Malaysia and not from Singapore. But I would also say that the difference is quite minimal, especially because a lot of people from Malaysia do come to Singapore to work and for many years. So sometimes you never find out that they're actually from Malaysia until maybe some time has passed. But I would say that the difference between Singapore and Malaysia is a bit more minimal, but there is a bigger difference between, let's say, Singapore and Malaysia Chinese versus Chinese in other locales. So, for example, the word straw, which in Singapore and Malaysia, we actually use the word 水草. Whereas if you compare it with standard Chinese, it is 吸管. So this is, I guess, a kind of local term that we use, and that's something that's different from the Chinese of other locales.
Oh, so you mean that's the part that as a localizer, that's the part that we should be paying attention to. So what you mean, like for Malaysian people, they would go to like coffee shop and ask for a straw, like 可以给我一支水草吗? Like this?
Yeah, something like this. So it's I guess you can think of it like a local term that is more commonly used. So if you're talking about the localization aspect, if you are trying to focus heavily on the Singapore or Malaysian market, you will have to do a little bit of market research to find out if the Chinese terms that you're trying to use in your content from China, Hong Kong, or Taiwan, if these words also have the same kind of usage in Singapore and Malaysia. So you do kind of need to do a little bit of research to see if there is that difference or not.
Got it. Wow, cool. Well, today we're talking about like different cultural identity in Singapore and how has Singlish formed right, based on like different cultural backgrounds. So there's one more question I would like to ask you specifically before we go to the end of the interview today. Like, for example, like in Taiwan, because we've been colonized by Japanese government in the late 19th century to the 20th. So I can say like in pretty much in Taiwanese, we've seen lots of words that we borrow from Japanese, and those words are still presented in Taiwanese. For example, like when it comes to tomato, like we use exactly the same word as Japanese, like tomato. When it comes to injection from hospital, we call it 注射. It's totally exactly the same as Japanese. So I wonder if there are some examples like that, like some words that you used. Some words in Singaporean are originated from English words. Any examples?
I think something that is pretty interesting is that we also do call like bus as 巴士 and taxi as 德士, which is an exact pronunciation of the English words.
德士.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes. But I can't really think of any other loanwords that are unique to Singapore per se. A lot of the loanwords are probably the same as in standard Mandarin, like cafe for coffee or lanyard for Bluetooth.
Oh, so you're talking about like the literal translation for example, Bluetooth in Chinese.
Yeah, as in, I mean, I don't think there are that many loanwords from English that are kind of unique to Singapore.
But speaking of loanwords from English, I think, Chinese in Singapore or even Hong Kong could be more like, it's more common in either Singaporean or Hong Kong Chinese than traditional Chinese in Taiwan, I think. Like you say, 德士. 德士 in Singapore and in Hong Kong.
Taxi.
Taxi, yeah. Taxi, yeah. But in Taiwan, we just call it 公车, so like it's totally different. Yeah. So I think, we seem to have more coin words or coin languages from Japanese instead of English. Yeah. But you both seem to have more coined words from English. That's interesting. Yeah. So after talking about the general cultural identity and how Singlish has been formed in Singapore, the special markets, I believe so far we've been like more familiar with this particular market, especially in the global localization map. So what exactly makes this country, this market so unique and popular and even different from other main markets? I think we can delve into this market a bit more in the following episodes, and we will be talking more about Singaporean, like Chinese or Singlish in terms of localization and what we should be paying attention to as a localization professional. So please stay tuned for more information if you still get interested in Singaporean markets, and we will see you next time. How many languages are supposed to be presented on the screen for audiences in a theater so that they can understand each other or the movie itself?
Or it was a foreign language movie, like maybe a Korean movie or an Italian movie, for example. Then usually the subtitles will be in English because that is the main language that everyone of all races can usually understand. You can also find some specific screenings that are in Chinese. These are usually catered towards like the older generation who don't understand English.
Excellent.
That's why we are able to be the connection for Southeast Asia to the world, and also
Yay!